The night pressed heavy against the windows of the house. From the outside, it looked ordinary. 2 stories, beige walls, curtains with faded flowers. A child's bicycle leaned against the fence as if waiting for its owner to return. Neighbors passed by with groceries, mothers called their kids inside, and the smell of tamales drifted from the corner stand. Everything seemed normal, even safe. But I knew better. Inside, the air was thick with damp plaster sweat and something metallic that clung to my throat. The hum of an old fan did nothing to chase away the stench. I sat at a folding table with a battered radio pressed against my chest, my hand trembling as I waited for the next call. My job was simple: announce colors. Green meant nothing unusual. Red meant suspicion. Black meant death. That was all. Observe and report. Nothing more. At least that was what they told me. Through the thin walls, muffled sounds bled into the silence. Low groans, sometimes a choked cry, sometimes a dull thud that shook the floorboards. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a television left on in another room. But as the hours dragged, I realized no television could produce the weight of those voices. Someone was inside, someone who wasn't meant to be seen. My orders were clear. Keep your eyes on the street, never ask questions, never acknowledge what you hear. So I stared through the slit in the curtain at the street lamp flickering across the pavement. A patrol car rolled by its siren off the officers, glancing casually toward the block. They didn't stop. They never stopped. That was the power of this place: silence, invisibility. The neighbors watered plants. Children kicked a worn soccer ball. And behind these walls, men were broken apart like discarded furniture. Every 30 minutes the radio crackled. Status. I pressed the button and answered with one word. Verde. Green. Normal. Safe. My voice had to be firm, calm, almost proud, as though nothing inside me was unraveling. But each time I spoke that word, I felt my own soul corroding. I wasn't guarding drugs or money. I was guarding screams. The irony gnawed at me. I had come here chasing respect, chasing the illusion that a man proves himself with guns, with chains of gold, with the fear in other men's eyes. I thought the Zetas would hand me that crown. Instead, they handed me this radio, this chair, this endless night of silence, broken only by suffering. I leaned back, closed my eyes for a second, and gripped the radio tighter. In that moment, I understood I had not entered a brotherhood. I had stepped into a machine built on fear, an organism that breathed through codes and whispers. My life, my family's life, now depended on how well I could play the shadow. You think Heriberto Lazcano ruled only with bullets, that his empire was built on firepower alone. No. His true weapon was something colder, quieter, more enduring. His weapon was fear. And I am here to tell you how it consumed everything I loved. I was not born into hunger or desperation. That is what makes my story different from the men who usually end up in this life. My father owned businesses, solid ones, not empires, but enough to keep us surrounded by comforts. My mother was one of those women obsessed with appearances, with hosting charity luncheons, and keeping the family's name shining in the social pages. We had a large house, maid's trips abroad, and private schools. I never had to count the coins in my pocket or worry about whether there would be food on the table. And yet inside, I felt empty. From a young age, everyone called me El Fresa, the spoiled kid, the one who would never understand hardship. At first, I laughed it off. Later, their words festered. To them, I was delicate, untouchable someone who could never walk among real men. Every joke about my soft hands or my polished shoes was a reminder that in their eyes, I would never be respected. My ego grew twisted. While other young men worked just to survive, I wasted nights in clubs watching the narcos enter with armored trucks. Gold chains, glinting women on their arms, and an aura that bent the entire room. People lowered their voices when they passed. Faces changed. Fear turned into respect right in front of me, and I told myself that was real masculinity power no one could buy, only seize with blood and violence. I married young. My wife was beautiful, radiant in a way that made strangers stare. When our son was born, it should have been enough. A house, a family stability, everything most men dreamed of. But I was restless, blind with testosterone, craving something darker. I loved them, but love was not enough to quiet the voice in my head, whispering that I was still just the spoiled boy who had never earned respect. The contradiction devoured me. By day, I played the role of husband and father, smiling at family dinners, holding my son in my arms. By night, I fantasized about walking into a club, surrounded by bodyguards with a pistol tucked into my waistband, commanding silence with a glance. I wanted to feel the kind of fear that only the Zetas inspired. So one night, half drunk at a party, I cornered a man I knew was tied to them. He wasn't a stranger, we had shared tables, bottles, women. But he lived in that world I envied. I looked him in the eyes and said, "I want in." At first, he laughed. He thought I was joking, another rich kid playing with fantasies. But when he saw I was serious, his expression shifted to pity, maybe even contempt. "Do you know what you're asking for?" he said. "There's no way back. Once you step in, the door closes behind you forever." I nodded, though inside I had no idea what those words meant. Forever. At that age, forever was a word for marriages, not for death. He warned me again, repeating that the consequences would last a lifetime. Still, I insisted. My arrogance was greater than my fear. And that was how I took the first step. When he finally introduced me to others, they didn't reject me. On the contrary, they admired my audacity. Few had the courage or the stupidity to seek them out. They said I had ambition guts. In that moment, I felt as if I had conquered something monumental. I was blind to the truth. I hadn't climbed a mountain, I had opened the gate of hell. That night, I returned home, my wife waiting with our son in her arms, asking how my evening had been. I smiled like a fool, believing I was shaping my destiny. In reality, I had just signed the sentence that would one day destroy everything I loved. The meeting place was nothing special, just another dimly lit bar where men drowned their sins in tequila and corridos blared from the jukebox. But to me, it felt like the threshold of another world. The man who had promised to introduce me sat across from me, his eyes half amused, half tired. He ordered another round, as if this were nothing more than a casual night out. Yet I knew that by the time we left, my life would no longer be mine. When they arrived, 3 of them, the room seemed to bend, not because they were loud or flamboyant, but because silence followed them. Other patrons lowered their voices. The bartender straightened his back. These men carried a weight you couldn't buy with money, the weight of violence, of blood already spilled. One of them, a mid-level commander, studied me like a hawk sizing up prey. "So this is the Fresa," he said, his grin sharp as a blade. "The one who wants to be a man." His voice carried no warmth, only a cold challenge. I swallowed hard, but forced myself to meet his gaze. "I'm ready," I said, though my stomach churned. He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out an old shortwave radio, the kind soldiers once carried. He shoved it into my hand. "If you want to prove yourself, you'll start as a halcon," he said. "Eyes and ears, nothing more. You report what you see, you use the codes, and you keep your mouth shut. No questions, no opinions, only orders." Part of me felt insulted. I had envisioned myself with a gun at my waist, riding in convoys, commanding respect. Instead, I was reduced to a lookout, a messenger boy. But I knew enough to stay quiet. To hesitate would have been to sign my death warrant. So I nodded, gripping the radio like it was a badge of honor. The next night, they gave me an address. It was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where women watered plants on the sidewalk and children played soccer in the street. Nothing about it screamed danger. Yet when I approached, two men leaned against the wall, smoking, their eyes sharp, their movements coiled. One of them looked me up and down. "This is the new kid," he muttered, then opened the gate. Inside, the air changed. The house looked ordinary from the outside, but once past the front door, I entered a world designed for secrecy. Narrow hallways, heavy locks, cameras in every corner. A folding table with radios and a battered notebook sat in a bare room where the paint peeled. An old fan rattled, pushing stale air around. The instructions were simple, drilled into me, as if my life depended on it, which it did. Every half hour, I was to report a color green if nothing happened, red if I saw suspicion, black if danger was imminent. Never ask what was inside. Never open doors. Never react to noises. That first shift, I stared out the curtain slit at the street. A boy chased a ball into the road. A woman balanced groceries on her hip. The normality was almost absurd. Every time the radio crackled, I said Verde in as firm a tone as I could muster. It felt like theater, like I was playing a soldier in a war no one outside could see. But then came the sound. A muffled thud followed by a low groan. I froze. My heart pounded. The others didn't flinch. One of them glanced at me and said coldly, "Keep watching the street. That doesn't exist for you." So I did. I fixed my eyes on the lamplight spilling across the pavement, while behind me the unseen machinery of horror kept grinding. When my shift ended, I stepped outside, chest puffed with false pride. I told myself I had passed the first test. I was no longer just the spoiled rich boy. I was part of something bigger, darker, more powerful. What I didn't realize was that with every Verde I reported, I was binding myself tighter to the silence that would one day bury me. They never called it a ceremony. There were no candles, no symbols, no oaths whispered in Latin. Yet, for me, the night they tested my loyalty was as much a rite of passage as any ritual in the old mafias of Sicily or the biker gangs up north. It began with silence. I was summoned to the house just before midnight, told to leave everything behind but the radio. Inside, the air was heavy with humidity and tension. The men gathered in a half-circle, faces hidden in the shadow of the weak light bulb swaying overhead. One of them, the veteran they called El Mayor, stepped forward. His skin looked like leather, his eyes unblinking. He held no weapon, but his presence alone pressed on my chest. "You want to be one of us," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. "Then you'll prove it the only way that matters. With silence. With obedience." They led me down a narrow hallway I had never walked before. At the end was a steel door, scratched and dented. A guard unlocked it, and the moment it swung open, a wave of stench hit me. Sweat, rot, metallic blood. My stomach knotted. Inside, 3 men sat chained to metal chairs. Their heads drooped, their bodies bruised and broken. One of them lifted his gaze to me, his eyes hollow but still begging. His lips parted, and he whispered, "Help me." I froze. The plea sliced through me like glass. Every instinct screamed to look away, to cover my ears, to deny what was in front of me. But El Mayor's hand clamped on my shoulder, his grip iron. "Look," he ordered. "If you cannot face this, you don't belong. If you flinch, you're no better than them." The guards circled the prisoners with the casual cruelty of men swatting flies. One backhanded a captive, splitting his lip open. Another shoved a bucket of water over a man's head, watching him sputter and choke. The cries filled the small room, echoing off the walls until they felt like they were inside my skull. I wanted to vomit. My knees shook. But I forced myself to stand still, jaw-clenched, eyes locked on the scene. My silence was not bravery. It was fear, pure and simple. Fear that if I looked away, if I gagged, if I spoke, I would be strapped to the fourth chair. After what felt like an eternity, El Mayor leaned close. His breath smelled of tobacco and bitterness. "This is not about bullets or courage," he said. "This is about control. Control of your mouth, control of your eyes, control of your soul. If you can bury your conscience here, you'll survive. If not, we'll bury you with them." Then he pulled me back into the hallway and shut the door. The muffled cries died into a heavy silence. My shirt clung to my skin with sweat. The men stared at me, waiting to see if I would break. I swallowed hard and gave the only answer I could. I nodded. One of them smirked. "The Frisa didn't puke," he said. "Maybe he has a spine after all." They handed me a bottle of cheap tequila, forced me to drink, until the burn numbed my throat. It was their way of sealing the night, of binding me to what I had witnessed. I stumbled home hours later, reeking of alcohol and despair. My wife asked no questions, though her eyes searched mine for something she couldn't name. I kissed my son's forehead as he slept, and the whisper from the prisoner echoed in my ears, "Help me." But I said nothing. My silence had become my initiation. After that night, there was no turning back. The radio became my lifeline, and my leash binding me to a cycle of orders, codes, and silence. They said I was still a rookie, but now I was trusted to hold my post alone. The task seemed simple on the surface. Every 30 minutes, I pressed the button and reported a color. Green meant the street was quiet. Yellow meant neighbors were watching too closely. Red meant a patrol car passed. Black meant an imminent raid. I thought it would be routine, mechanical, like calling out moves in a game of chess. But with every report, I felt the walls closing tighter around me. One afternoon, while stationed near the garage, I noticed dark stains on the concrete floor, thick, irregular, not the pattern of spilled oil. They dragged across the surface in lines, as if chains had been pulled with struggling weight. I knew what they were, but I forced myself to look away. Asking questions was forbidden, and curiosity was punished with a bullet. So I picked up the broom and swept as if I had seen nothing. The veterans taught me how to blend into the neighborhood, sweep the sidewalk in the morning, water the plants, buy small items at the corner store, never in bulk, play music at low volume so the house felt alive but not loud enough to invite suspicion. Every detail mattered. The house had to breathe like a normal family home, even as screams seeped from its walls. My first true mission came one humid night. I was told to watch for a particular vehicle, an old blue sedan missing its rear plate. If it passed, I was to report Rojo with no hesitation. Hours passed with nothing but stray dogs and the occasional taxi. Then, headlights cut across the corner. The sedan rolled by slowly, 2 men inside, their eyes darting. My chest tightened. My finger pressed the radio. Rojo. The word cracked the air. Within minutes, armed men moved like shadows through the house. I wasn't told what happened next. All I know is the sedan never came back. The next morning, children played soccer in the street, and the neighbors greeted each other as if nothing had shifted. Only I knew that someone had disappeared in the silence. Each mission stripped away another piece of me. At first, my hands trembled when I spoke into the radio. By the 3rd week, my voice was steady, almost detached. I told myself it was survival, that I had no choice. Yet part of me also felt pride that I was trusted, pride that I was no longer just the rich boy with soft hands. I was proving myself, or so I thought, but pride is poison. One evening, the groans from inside grew louder, sharper. The man inside was pleading, his cries bleeding through the thin walls. I clenched my fists, forcing my eyes to stay on the quiet street. My radio buzzed. Status. I pressed the button, my voice calm. Verde. Green. Normal. As if nothing was happening. When my shift ended, I staggered home. My wife was waiting, our son asleep in her arms. She asked why I looked pale, but I only shook my head. I couldn't tell her that I had just declared everything normal while a man begged for his life behind me. That was the first time I realized the mission was not to protect drugs or weapons. The mission was to protect the lie that silence could cover screams, that a house could hide horror, that neighbors could live blind in the shadow of hell. And I was the guardian of that lie. It didn't take long for silence to become my second skin. I learned to report without hesitation, to hold my face like stone even when my insides churned. That discipline, that obedience, was what they rewarded. Slowly, I began to rise. They moved me from a single post to coordinating others. Now, when a new recruit stood trembling with a radio in his hands, I was the one giving orders. Eyes on the corner. Half-hour codes. No questions. The irony was bitter. I had once been that boy desperate to prove myself, and now I was shaping others into shadows. With the promotion came new privileges. I was invited to gatherings, small at first, nights in hidden ranches where trucks lined the dirt roads and armed men stood guard under the moonlight. The tables overflowed with bottles, music, and women who laughed too loudly to hide the fear in their eyes. I watched the commanders toast with golden watches on their wrists, pistols tucked into their belts, their confidence radiating like fire. This was the world I had envied from afar, now within my reach. But power in the Zetas was never free. With every step up the ladder came blood on my hands, even if not directly. I was assigned to oversee safe houses, not just the one where I started, but others scattered across neighborhoods that looked deceptively peaceful. Each had its own set of codes, its own crew of halcones, its own captives, whose voices haunted the walls. My job was to make sure everything ran smooth, rotations, signal supplies, and above all, secrecy. I learned the protocols by heart. Floors had to be scrubbed with bleach, garbage burned to ash, receipts torn and flushed. Curtains were to be drawn just enough to let light escape, but never enough to reveal the inside. Even dogs were considered alarms. If a neighbor's mutt stopped barking, we noted the time. The house itself was treated like a living creature, and we were its organs, keeping it alive with routine. I thought the work would harden me, but instead it hollowed me out. Still, I convinced myself it was proof of loyalty. I had come too far to back out now. One day, El Mayor himself pulled me aside. His eyes were sharp as broken glass. "You've got potential, Moro," he said. "You don't ask stupid questions. You don't flinch. That's what we need." He handed me a pistol, heavy and cold, in my hand. "Now you're not just eyes. You're part of the arm." I told myself I had finally achieved what I wanted: respect. The others looked at me differently, no longer as the spoiled boy. I commanded Halconi's coordinated signals, passed orders down the chain. At night, I drove in convoys' engines growling through the city, while civilians stared terrified from sidewalks. The fear I once admired in others' eyes was now reflected back at me. And yet, with every step higher, the abyss widened beneath me. I saw more of the machinery doctors brought in to keep captives alive, for interrogation trucks moving not just drugs, but people who would never be seen again, politicians turning their heads in exchange for envelopes. The illusion of brotherhood crumbled. What bound us together wasn't loyalty, but fear. Still, I kept moving upward like a man climbing a burning ladder. I told myself it was too late to go back. that I had to play the role to the end. In those days, people said I was becoming someone to be feared. But in the mirror, I saw something else, a man already enslaved by the silence he once thought would make him powerful. By the time I was fully inside, I realized the cartel wasn't a family, it was a cage. A cage gilded with gold, flooded with music and liquor, but a cage nonetheless. The rules were carved into our skin. They called it disciplina, but it was more like chains invisible to the outside world. The first rule was silence. Questions were forbidden. Curiosity was weakness. Even a raised eyebrow at the wrong time could mark you as unreliable. The second rule was loyalty, unconditional, unquestioned, blind. The third was fear. Not fear of the police, not even of rival cartels. Fear of your own brothers, the ones who would execute you without hesitation if the order came. I saw punishments carried out in brutal detail. A man who had spoken too freely after drinking was forced to kneel in the center of the house. They stripped him down and beat him until the walls shook, then dragged his body into a truck. He never returned. Another who failed to report on time was locked in a windowless room for days, no food, no water. When they pulled him out, he was a hollow shell, a warning for all of us. Yet between these punishments, the nights could look like paradise. Long tables piled with food and bottles, music blasting, women dancing under neon lights. Trucks parked outside with engines still running. Armed men laughing with their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. To an outsider, it might have looked like power, glory, even joy. But I had learned by then those parties were masks. Behind every laugh hid suspicion. Behind every hug hid a knife. I tried to keep my circle small. Some men lived for the chaos, bragging about their kills, boasting about the money they threw away in clubs. Others were shadows like me, quiet, calculating, terrified of making the wrong move. I trusted no one fully, not even the man who had first introduced me. In the Zetas, friendship was a liability. Today's drinking companion could be tomorrow's executioner. It was in these gatherings that I first saw the so-called doctores del dolor. They didn't wear white coats. They looked like ordinary men, sometimes with glasses, sometimes dressed neatly as if they'd just left an office. They arrived with small cases, greeted the commanders politely, and disappeared behind locked doors. Hours later they emerged, their hands smelling faintly of alcohol and iron. We knew what they were doing, keeping captives alive just enough to prolong their suffering, just enough to extract another name, another secret. To the organization, they were as valuable as any sicario. Every day was a performance. During shifts, I stood like a sentinel, reporting codes into the radio, pretending to be indifferent. During nights of celebration, I forced a smile, clinking glasses with men whose eyes never softened. And when I returned home, I wore a different mask for my wife and son. I told myself I was protecting them by keeping them in the dark, but the truth is, I was already dragging them into my hell. What struck me most inside the organization was not the violence we all expected that. It was the constant suspicion. No one was ever safe. The higher you climbed, the sharper the blades aimed at your back. Every man lived with the knowledge that one wrong word, one mistake, one flicker of doubt could place your name in the black notebook. Once it was written there, your days were numbered. The Zetas promised power, and they gave it, but only enough to keep you enslaved. They fed you with money and fear in equal measure until you couldn't tell the difference between loyalty and survival. By then, I understood the truth. I wasn't inside a brotherhood. I was inside a machine that consumed men whole and spat out ghosts. And no matter how far I rose, I would never escape its shadow. I used to believe the cartel existed in its own universe, separated from the world of suits and politics. But the higher I climbed, the clearer it became the line between the underworld and the so-called respectable world was nothing but smoke. It started with whispers. During meetings, commanders would mention names I recognized. Not sicarios, not smugglers, but local politicians, businessmen, even a priest or two. At first, I thought it was boasting a way to inflate their power. Then, I saw it with my own eyes. One night, I was summoned to a ranch outside the city. The place was vast, hidden behind gates taller than a man, with horses grazing in the moonlight and a mansion glowing at the end of the drive. Inside, I expected to find Lazcano himself, or at least his closest circle. Instead, I saw men in tailored suits, their hands heavy with rings, sipping whiskey beside men I knew had tortured captives hours earlier. They laughed together as if they belonged to the same fraternity. That was the moment I understood we weren't just a cartel. We were a cog in a machine that stretched far beyond us. The safe houses could not exist without the blindness of the police. The torture rooms could not operate without doctors willing to sell their conscience. The disappearances could not remain hidden without the complicity of officials who signed papers and closed cases before they were ever opened. One commander leaned close to me that night and whispered, "Do you think we run this city alone? Moro, we are only the visible hand. The invisible ones dine with us, toast with us, and collect their share." His laughter was bitter, but it carried no regret. I began to notice the signs everywhere. Patrol cars driving slowly past our houses without stopping. Judges who dismissed charges before they reached the courtroom. Businessmen who laundered our money in construction projects and nightclubs. Politicians who showed up at parties, their ties loosened their lips, whispering promises for campaign donations. It was a web intricate and suffocating. Lazcano sat at the center, yes, but he was not alone. The true power was the system itself, a marriage of fear and greed that stretched from the barrios to the government halls. We were soldiers, pawns, even enforcing the silence, while others in higher offices reaped the benefits. That realization cut deeper than any initiation. I had joined believing I would prove myself as a man, that I would seize respect with my own hands. Instead, I was nothing more than a piece moved across a board by men whose faces rarely touched the dirt. And yet, there was no way out. Once you saw the larger conspiracy, you were bound even tighter. Because to acknowledge it was to admit you were expendable, replaceable, and watched. Any hint of disloyalty could not just cost your life, it could topple the delicate balance between the cartel and its invisible partners. That was why silence mattered so much, not only to hide the screams inside the houses, but to protect the truth that the violence was not chaos, it was business. I remember one evening sitting at my post, the radio warm in my hand. Across the street, a politician's car parked its windows, tinted black. He entered the house next door, greeted by one of our men as if they were old friends. The neighbors waved unsuspecting. Children kept playing. No one questioned why a man with power in City Hall walked so comfortably into our shadow. That was when I realized the cruelest truth: the cartel did not corrupt the state. The cartel was part of the state, and men like me were simply its disposable armor. The beginning of the end came quietly, like a shadow slipping under the door. At first, it was only glances. Men avoiding my eyes, conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. Then came the silences. Too long, too heavy, like the air itself was warning me. El Mayor was the first to notice the crack in my armor. One night after a long shift, he studied me with those dry eyes that seemed to see through bone. "Your stomach is weak, Moro," he said. "I can smell it. A man like that doesn't last here." His voice was calm, but every syllable felt like a nail being driven into my coffin. I tried to bury my doubts, to wear the mask tighter. I kept reporting the codes verde, rojo, negro, as if nothing inside me had shifted. but I knew the others had already marked me. And in the Zetas, once suspicion touched your name, it spread like rot. The weight became unbearable when it reached my home. For months, I had convinced myself that my family was safe as long as I played my role. But then, I overheard a transmission on the radio, casual, almost careless. A woman and a child had been lifted in a nearby neighborhood to be neutralized. The description froze my blood, a young woman with long hair carrying a boy, wrapped in a blue blanket. It was them. I wanted to scream, to throw the radio across the room to beg for mercy. But I sat frozen, the radio buzzing against my palm, my face a mask of indifference. Any crack, any tear, any sign of weakness would have condemned me instantly. So I stayed silent while my wife and son were erased from the world. That night, something inside me died. I went home, looked at the empty bed, smelled the faint perfume still clinging to the sheets, and understood I had sacrificed everything for an illusion. Respect, manhood. They had all been lies. What I had truly earned was ash. After that, every step in the safe house was torture. The screams of prisoners blurred into the cries of my son. The smell of bleach and iron twisted into the scent of my wife's hair. Each report of Verde felt like a betrayal chiseled deeper into my chest. I walked the hallways like a ghost, waiting for the order that would drag me to the center room, force me to kneel and finish what my arrogance had started. The isolation was the worst. My so-called brothers no longer shared cigarettes with me, no longer laughed in my direction. Some avoided being on shift when I was present, as if my death sentence might be contagious. Even the parties became suffocating. Where once I had clinked glasses with men who treated me as equal, now they barely acknowledged my existence. I lived each day like an animal in a slaughterhouse, ears tuned for the footsteps that would come for me. Every crack of a door, every cough in the hallway, every flicker on the radio sent my heart hammering. Sleep abandoned me. Food turned to dust in my mouth. My body was alive, but my soul had already curled into a corner, bracing for the final blow. And still, I kept playing the role. I stood, my shifts pressed the radio button, said Verde in a steady voice. I performed obedience because it was the only thread keeping me alive. But deep down, I knew the black notebook already held my name. The collapse of a man does not happen in one moment. It is a slow unraveling, a silent erosion. By then, I was no longer a husband, no longer a father, no longer even a soldier. I was a shell wearing the uniform of fear. The only question left was not if I would fall, but when and how brutally. I survived, but not because I was stronger, or smarter, or braver. I survived because ghosts are easy to overlook, and by then, I had already become one. The night I slipped out was not planned. There was no grand escape, no firefight, no chase through darkened alleys. Just a door left ajar, a gust of air that moved the curtain in the laundry room, and the certainty that if I stayed one more day, the house itself would devour me. I walked out slowly, each step measured, my heart pounding like thunder in my ears. Outside, the neighborhood breathed in its false innocence. Children's bicycles, dogs barking at shadows, a woman sweeping her porch. I blended into that routine, one more figure in the crowd, until the house disappeared behind me. But leaving the house did not mean leaving the silence. The radio had carved itself into my skull. Even when I abandoned it in a trash bin, its static lived on inside me. Every honk, every siren, every dog's bark turned into codes I couldn't stop decoding. Verde, rojo, negro. My body had been trained into obedience, and even in freedom, I was still chained. I fled from city to city, changing names, jobs, faces. I worked in markets, on construction sites, in warehouses. I ate, alone, slept in rooms where the walls sweated with damp, never speaking more than I had to. Sometimes I convinced myself that anonymity was redemption, that disappearing was the way to protect the memory of my family. Other times, I knew the truth. It was only cowardice dressed as survival. What haunted me most were not the screams I had heard, nor the blood I had smelled, but the silence I had maintained. Every time I pressed that button and said Verde, I was choosing lies over life. I told myself it was survival, but survival built on complicity is just another form of death. That is why I speak now. Not to glorify, not to excuse, but to confess. Because silence is what allows monsters to thrive, and for too long, I was their guardian. If you think Lazcano ruled by bullets alone, you are wrong. His empire was built on fear, a fear so deep it seeped into every brick of those houses, into every radio frequency, into every man who stood watch, pretending not to hear the truth behind the walls. Fear kept us obedient. Fear made us complicit. And fear is what still hunts me long after I escaped. You want to know the real cost of chasing respect. It is not the gold chains or the convoys. It is holding your son's blue blanket in your memory, and knowing he will never wake beneath it again. It is feeling your wife's perfume fade from your skin because you traded her embrace for the stench of blood. It is realizing too late that manhood is not forged in violence, but in protection, protecting what you love, not destroying it. I was not a man. I was a shadow, a fool who mistook cruelty for strength, and I am condemned to carry that truth until my last breath. So listen to me. If you stand at the door I once knocked on, turn away. If someone offers you the illusion of power through fear, refuse it. If you think being a man means holding a gun, remember my words. The true power is holding your family close, walking home alive and sleeping without ghosts, gnawing at your conscience. The invisible boss is not a man with a name. The true boss is fear itself, and once you let it in, it never leaves.